My name's Philip Skuce. I'm a principal scientist at the Moredun Research Institute just outside Edinburgh. Liver fluke's a kind of pervasive problem in this part of the northwestern Europe. It used to be very seasonal. Farmers knew roughly when to expect it and what to do about it. But with changing weather patterns, we've seen it's become very unpredictable. And the best way to deal with that is to do some testing or monitoring. So you're kind of keeping an eye on things and knowing what to look for. And that will give you an indication of when fluke is peaking and what to do about it. And if you do need to treat, what products to use, because it's a little bit complicated. The flucicides all have a sort of different age kill range in the animal, and that takes a little bit of getting your head around. I mean, there's always a good time to test. It used to be you would treat in the autumn. That was because fluke was very seasonal, but that seasonality is breaking down, so it's cropping up at unexpected times, and it's lower and later than usual, or just unexpected. So monitoring is a good way to do that. We have a number of options for fluke. I mean, normally roundworms is pretty much just an egg count, but with fluke we've got a few extra options. I mean, there's typically post-mortem, so if fallen stock or animals that are going to slaughter, you can get reports back of the condition of their livers. That's very useful information. There are now blood tests for fluke as well. So there's a test where you get the vet to come out and take a sample, send the sample to the lab for testing, and that detects antibodies, which the animals produce in response to infection. But a new test has come out, or a new version of that blood test is in a lateral flow format, a bit like the COVID test. So that's allows farmers to do the test sort of pen side and make decisions rapidly when they've gathered animals. So that's a step in the right direction. There's also a lab-based test called the coproantigen test, which picks up a secretion in a fecal sample. So it's an easy sample to take, but the sample is then sent to the lab for testing. And it's a very sensitive test, but it's a little bit expensive. And then finally there's the egg count, which is a cheap and cheerful entry-level test, really, but it's a useful test in its own way. The only thing to bear in mind is that it's adult fluke only lay eggs, so you have to remember there could be 6 to 8 weeks worth of immatures coming up behind that. So the egg counts, it's a very valuable test in its own right. I would prefer farmers get away from routine treatments. I think there's nothing routine about the climate anymore. The weather patterns change, grazing management changes, and so we need to be aware of that. The fluke will adapt to that. They're very highly evolved, adapted parasites, so we need to keep ahead of them. I think monitoring is the best way to do that. We can sit and pontificate about what we think is happening to the fluke risk, but the best way to tell what's actually happening is to monitor animals that are outside exposed to that infection. Yeah, housing is interesting, certainly for cattle. I mean, it takes animals out of harm's way pretty much at a time of year when there might be fluke infection out there, so that's good in its own right. But also it gives you an opportunity to treat them and clear the fluke infections. So you need to have a think about, consider that the animals could be carrying a fluke burden into housing. So you might need to wait a few weeks depending on the product you choose. Testing is always worth doing as well, just to see that they genuinely are not shedding eggs and they're not going out to pasture next year shedding eggs that will then get into the snails and cause a problem for that season. So there are merits in treatment around that time, because it saves the animals having a burden during the housing period, so they're tip-top condition when they're housed. So there's all sorts of good reasons for monitoring and testing them and treating them at housing. Being able to risk assess a farm or even a field for fluke is a good skill to have sort of a working understanding of the liver fluke life cycle and sort of what's happening at any given time of the year, to understand what the mud snail habitat looks like, and to understand the risk the animals might be facing. We're lucky that there are some very good resources out there, so I would point farmers and crofters to the likes of the Scots, so Sustainable Control of Parasites in Sheep website, and also the cows, the cattle equivalent. But it's a really good website as well. There's a lot of carefully crafted resources there. The thought process around testing, about the different treatment options, about resistance, and general management and best practice. So I would certainly point people at those.